Thanks indeed, Murray, and I'm delighted, truly delighted to be here. It's been some time since I've been able to spend any time in this part of Canada. I went to school not far from here at Pearson College for 2 years, and so I came to know Victoria quite well. And I have to say, coming in, I said rather naively, were all of those buildings on the other side of James Bay here 30 years ago? And Murray said, I rather doubt it, and I think he was right. But effectively, I've already been to 5 provinces talking about the NDP's proposals, long-standing proposals, but deepening proposals for reforming our voting system for a form of proportional representation. Lots of great feedback that began June of 2013. What's most important to note is this is an approach by our party that not only is rooted in almost 30 years of advocacy, starting with Ed Broadbent, over 30 in fact, but 20 years of commitment to PR, over 10 years of commitment to a particular form of PR, and now the advent of a leader of the NDP who is so fully committed to PR that I honestly think that but I would prefer to say when he becomes Prime Minister, one of the legacies he wants to leave us, Tom Mulcair wants to leave, is that a Prime Minister who did things as a matter of principle that helped turn our democracy around, because everybody in this room knows that on multiple fronts we're in trouble. He's been unequivocal, as indicate up here in the PowerPoint, that we are committed to making 2015, that is next year, the last unfair election. We're proposing a particular system. You'll see, as I explain a little bit how it works, mixed member proportional, MMP, that has used successfully in several countries, but the ones I like to always highlight are Germany, New Zealand, and Scotland. 3 countries with rather robust democracies that I think already speak favorably to why we should at least look very, very carefully at a model that these 3 countries have embraced. Now our plan is, and this is where I'll put it in a little more detail in a sec, but this is where tonight I'm deepening our commitment even further. Tom has made very clear that 2015 is to be the landmark election for moving us to a new system. But how are we going to do that? First of all, we need to be elected. The second thing is we will be setting up very quickly after being elected a task force that will be made up of people from different parties, not necessarily MPs, but different parties. The price of admission will be that if you're from a different party than the NDP or Greens, who already support PR, you also have to be a supporter of PR, because this will be a very focused task force to design the features of a mixed member proportional system adapted for Canada. Once that task force recommendations are received, then it comes to the government that will be working in parallel on a model legislation. We'll work with what the task force has suggested by way of consultation with experts and citizens, table the legislation, and then we'll be working to deadlines to make sure that the legislation is implemented in time for the statutory 2019 election. So that is, in many respects, a even further precision of something that was already implicit in what Tom said last September, a year ago this September. On Democracy Day, as you can see, electoral reform is an important way to reinvigorate our democracy, and in 2015, New Democrats will be seeking a mandate to introduce a proportional representation voting system that better reflects the true political preferences of Canadians, and here's the key in terms of the commitment we are committed to ensuring that 2015 is the last unfair election. Just so that it's as clear as possible, what I just summarized is here again. An NDP government will strike an all-party task force. It'll have a mandate to consult with experts and citizens. Often, very often, they're one and the same. Without fair vote, for example, and the citizen expertise of a decade or more, we would be nowhere near in a position as a party to have taken what I think is a fairly brave step in how we're pushing for proportional representation. And the issue is it will be on the best design of an MMP, a mixed member proportional system. It will not be free and open discussion about should we change the system, what system should it be. The mandate that we'll be seeking in the election is to do this. We'll then introduce the legislation, and as it says there, work to legislative deadlines that would allow the system to be in place in time for the next election, and statutorily that would be in 2019. The Liberal Party, it's important to contrast the two other parties that are talking about electoral reform. Doesn't support PR, supports something called ranked ballots or alternative voting. They've explained their reasons, and I won't go into them now, but what's very important, and they acknowledge this, it's not a system of proportional representation, and Mr. Trudeau has been very clear on multiple occasions that he is against proportional representation. The Green Party is our clear ally. Not only has Elizabeth May been speaking about PR as if it's a given for the Green Party for some time, but the form of the Green Party's commitment to proportional representation has clarified and deepened with their convention in August, this past August, to make the two parties' positions virtually identical. In fact, we're at some level catching up to the Green Party in proposing an all-party task force. Before we were talking in more general terms about an all-party committee. It wasn't clear whether it was parliamentary, but what's important to note is that the Green Party in the past insisted in their policy that a Royal Commission would have to be struck, and then after the Royal Commission recommended whether or not PR and whatever form of PR should come in, that includes leaving open something like ranked balloting, that there should be a referendum. All three of those elements have been removed, and now the Green Party is fully committed to proportional representation using a all-party process with no fixed deadline in the way that we've put it, but it's for all intents and purposes very compatible with what we're at. So we consider the Green Party an ally, and we hope that Green Party voters will consider the NDP an ally, given that under the current system in the last election, we all know that Elizabeth May was the only one elected in 2011 from the Greens, but if there had been a proportionate representation of the Green Party, we would have seen close to or up to 12 Green MPs. So I'm just going to take a step back. What does PR mean? I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page when we talk about proportional representation. Effectively, it means the number of seats a party has in the House of Commons should be proportionate to the popular vote they've received. If you get 30% of the vote, roughly speaking, you should have around 30% of the MPs, 30% of the seats, put it in that way. Philosophically, almost, every vote counts equally. Every voter counts equally as a person. Let's start from that premise, and if that's so, so should every vote count equally. And I'll explain why it is that votes don't currently count equally in any meaningful way in our system. All votes should have the same weight in determining the makeup of the House of Commons. So that's a kind of an extension of the principle that all voters count equally. And it's not so much explaining what PR is, but explaining one consequence of a proportional representation system. It will give us a House of Commons. It will help us work towards and build, is probably more accurate, a House of Commons that reflects the balance of a diversity of opinion in our country in a way much better than currently occurs, and produce a more balanced politics and a more consensual, collegial, cross-party approach to solution-seeking legislation and effectively the forward movement of the country as a whole. The reason that the trigger for that is that proportional representation gets mirrored, gets mapped onto the popular vote. It is rare, or almost will be impossible in our future, for us to be thinking of any given party receiving 50% of the popular vote, and therefore 50% of the seats. We'd have to go back to a time when there were only two parties, and occasionally one would get over 50%, the other would get a little bit less than 50%. But we live in a universe where, with the Conservatives, the Liberals, the Greens, the NDP, and in provinces like Quebec, parties like the Bloc, almost impossible. to think of it being a norm or even happening more than once or twice in a century. That being the case, it means that there is no longer the investment on the part of parties in constantly positioning themselves in the House of Commons and in their relationships with the government with the official opposition, in an antagonistic and adversarial way that always treats the other party effectively as a kind of enemy. Adversary at the best of times, enemy at the worst of time, because you're trying to position yourself to be in the best position to defeat that party and become the government. When you know you're always going to potentially have to work with every other party, either in terms of coalition forming or seeking support agreements, you're already moderating your behavior in light of the future. Plus the mere fact that there's no one party that has a majority of the seats means there just must be consensus-seeking, cross-party negotiations, which also will empower MPs, because the experience in minority governments when they happen in our current system is that when parties have to talk and broker and achieve sort of, let's say, overlapping insights into what the best approach is, MPs in their interest areas or their critic areas end up playing a much more important role, including on committees, for example, than they do in our system when a government has a majority and can, if they want to, dominate everything in the way that the current government wants to. Did I say wants to? Does. So how does the current system work? Well, FPTP, the current system is in formalese called the single member plurality system. You have a single member representing a riding, and all they have to receive is a plurality of the votes. They don't have to receive over 50%. They just have to receive one vote more than anybody else to be elected. And we call that metaphorically, and I'll show you a picture about why, the first past the post system. Each voter, and this is reminding almost everyone in the room what you already do, but it's a helpful reminder I hope you'll realize in a moment. Each voter votes once for her choice amongst the candidates vying to be the MP in their brief riding. Votes once. You all kind of remember the last election you voted? You just tick once. That's it. That's the end of your voting roll. That single vote must integrate your views on the local candidates for representing your 100,000 person riding, more or less, that you live in, with whatever your views are on which party you would prefer to do better in terms of representation in the House of Commons, which always, increasingly in our political culture, blurs with what you think about the leader of that party. And you're meant to integrate all of these things into one vote. The candidate with the most votes is elected MP, that is the plurality, and it's in that sense that we also refer to this as a winner-take-all system. So there we are. That's one of my doodles from a while ago, and you can see, here's the post, all right? This jockey here with the 9,000 votes is the first past the post. Not so far ahead, but clearly ahead of the second one with 8,000 votes, 7. I guess that's a 4-2, and then I'm not sure which party, maybe the marijuana party in Ontario, but not necessarily in BC, is here. And so as you can see, 9,000 gets you the seat, but 9,000 over, adding all this up, 30,070 votes is 30%. So you can become the MP for the riding with that. And this is not that uncommon in ridings, 30% in ridings where there's a three-way split of some kind. So when you think of it that way, that's what happens in each individual riding, but each of Canada's 308 ridings, in next year it will be 338, sends an MP to the House of Commons in exactly that horse race way. In effect, our system conceptualizes our country as a country of 308 or 338 side-by-side localities or local ridings. And this additive approach to constituting the national House of Commons leads to the potential for false majorities. A false majority means that when you add up all the votes one party has received across those ridings, and then you look at the percentage, and then you add up the percentage of seats they've actually got, it's the norm in our history since Confederation that parties form majority governments, that is, they have more seats in the House of, they have 50% or more of the seats in the House of Commons for one party, with less than 50% of the national vote. And in fact, 40% has traditionally been the magic figure for that, and in recent years it's getting even less. The Harper government has generated 54% of the seats of the House of Commons with 39.5% of the votes. The recent victory by the Liberals in Ontario was even less. It was between around 38%. The Bob Rae NDP government from many years ago in Ontario got a healthy majority with 37.5% of the vote. So that's what's known as a false majority. And false is a good word, because if you talk to many of your colleagues or friends or family who have no reason to, and I'm not saying they should, but who have no particular reason to know the full mechanics of our system other than knowing that they're voting for a local MP and knowing that at some level they're voting for an MP and then trying to figure out what party they're voting for and which leader they might want to try to vote for in a way that affects the national result. There's a huge percentage of Canadians who do not know that when we talk about landslides and surges and majority governments, that we're not talking about the popular vote. We're talking about the seats that result. And many people internalize that and just assume that a majority government has been formed through majority support of Canadians. And no, it's been formed by a majority of ridings in which individuals may be winning with far less than 50% of the votes in some of those ridings. And that's why you get the distortions. I'll talk to you later in the questions maybe about what a perverse majority is and what an inflated majority is, but these are even worse pathologies of our system. So let's just look at the 2011 election, the last election. So up here is the popular vote across Canada. And down here is the percentage of seats that individual parties got. So without picking on them too much again, the Conservatives received 39% of the vote. They get 54% of the seats. The NDP, because of where we were in the sweet spot of how the system works, we got a few more seats than we should have. The NDP got 30% of the vote, but we got 33% of the seats. In fact, we got about 9 seats more than we would have if it was a fully proportional result. The Liberals got a lot less than they should have. They came in with 19%. Their vote collapsed in a certain sense. They went down to 19%. But that gave them only 11% of the seats. So although they ended up as a rump, so to speak, in the House of Commons, it really, at some level, proportionally, they didn't deserve to go down that much. And of course, the best and most stark example is the Greens. The Green Party received roughly 4% of the national vote in 2011 and ended up with 0.3% of the seats. That's Elizabeth May's seat and won, and if in fact 4% of the vote had been given to the Greens, it would be closer to 12. So those are an example of just this last election of distortions. What's really important to know is this debate should in no way focus on the results of 2011, the fact that the Conservatives happen to be the ones benefiting from the system. In the following sense, this happens as the norm. The 3 Karchen majorities were produced with the Liberals receiving in the low 40s and even once the high 30s, but getting very high majority numbers of seats. NDP governments across the country in provinces have benefited from the same dynamics. And as you'll see, if you break up the country into different provinces in 2011, the NDP over-benefited from our system in Quebec. Everybody talked about the surge. It was a surge. The orange wave was a wave, but it was 44% of the vote, which is huge, just an amazing gain for the NDP. It was not 50%. It was not 60%, it was not 70%, and yet we ended up with 59 out of the 75 Quebec seats because of how the system works. Alberta always sends virtually every member from the Conservative Party, for as long as anybody can remember, to the House of Commons, and yes, the Conservatives get well over 50% of support, but they get nowhere near 100%. And yet in the last election, 27 out of 28 MPs in the House of Commons from Alberta are from the Conservative Party, while around 30% of the electorate are not voting Conservative. In Saskatchewan, the NDP received 33% of the vote, 1/3 of the vote in 2011, and out of 14 seats, we got 0, with 33% of the vote. The Liberals picked up 1, all the rest went to the Conservatives. So what's this doing? This is producing not only unfairness, but it's exacerbating our sense of a country of starkly different regions that completely overstates the diversity of perspectives and voting intention in each province. Alberta is not nearly as monolithic as that, and Quebec is not nearly the same. The Conservatives should have had many more seats, considerably more seats in Quebec than they did, for example. So it's a system that also overstates big time, exacerbates, and creates almost caricature images of our provincial differences. So with 10 minutes to go, roughly, one way to look at the last election is to look at, the Conservatives is the easiest. Conservatives, they did receive that percentage of the vote. Given the number of seats, 308 back at the moment, they should only have got 122. Instead, they get 166. That means the distortion is they get 45 more seats than a fully proportional approach would have given. That amounts to plus 14% more between the popular vote and the seats. And you can do that across the board in the same way as I was doing with the pie chart. Look at BC. You can do this province by province, and I already gave some of the examples, but in BC it's not nearly as bad as the overall national, well, it's close actually. Nationally, the Conservatives got 14 to 15% more than they should have, and in BC, indeed, they had 13% more seats than proportionality should have given, 5 more seats than they should have. The NDP was pretty much a wash, so we should have gotten 12, we did get 12, but it was the Liberals and the Greens who were shortchanged. The 5 seats that the Conservatives got that they shouldn't have, if it were proportional, would have gone 2 to the Liberals, 3 to the Liberals and 2 to the Greens. And that was the Quebec example. So every vote clearly does not count in our current system. There is a wasted vote. Think of all those horses behind the winning horse. If the winning horse was the party that formed government, then everybody, all the other votes, all the other horses people were backing, were votes that did nothing to contribute to the majority government and therefore to helping govern the country. And the reason this is important is that when you get a majority in our Westminster system and then you have a Prime Minister willing to use all the tools of power available in our Westminster system, then 50% plus 1 of the seats can easily transmit into 100% of the power if you're willing to use it and ram legislation through, not take the opposition seriously, etc. It's an unfair representation of preferences. That's why Fair Vote uses the terminology of fair. And it also, another way to look at it is a different number of votes are taken to elect a given MP in any election from any party. So take 2000 election. The Liberals got 57% of the seats with only 41% of the vote. So it's not just the Conservatives in 2011. So it took roughly 30,000 votes. 30,000 votes for each Liberal seat. For each NDP seat, 84,000 votes had to be cast across the country to end up with an NDP seat, and in that election, 130,000 to elect a progressive Conservative. So it's another way of thinking about the unequal impact of votes at any given time. So let me just review quickly. I'm just going to state them. I'm not going to explain them. Apart from the unfairness of the false majorities that I've been emphasizing, I already told you about the false sense and exacerbation of regional differences. I think that should be at the top. It is huge. It diminishes the diversity of viewpoints in parliaments from different areas of the country, so that actually impacts on legislation. It's not just this perception of how regions differ. It means that if you have an issue that really is located mostly in Alberta, all the voices you're hearing from Alberta are ideologically in one track. You're not hearing from the other voices in Alberta that would deal with that same issue. Let's just say the tar sands in a different way than the ones who ended up being elected. Because it leads to majorities that then turn into disciplined blocks of votes that are controlled by the Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister is that sort of Prime Minister, you can ram legislation through while not taking into account 60% of the electorate, because you're not taking into account the MPs elected by 60% of the electorate. It promotes adversarialism, hyperpartisanship, over cooperative and compromise activity. I think I've explained that a bit already. It enhances the chances of poor legislation because single ideologies, tunnel vision, thinking within the four corners of your own mind, that is the mind of a bunch of people who share your views, ends up blinding you to problems with your perspective and to other ways of looking at the issue, and doesn't require you to do the hard work of working through differences to see whether or not a better approach can be found. And finally, it actually has a role in undermining the role of MPs in Parliament, due to the fact that because you only cast one vote in our system, and you're asked to, in that one vote, decide, do you like or want that candidate? What do you think about the party? What do you think about the party's leader? All the studies suggest that a huge percentage of people focus a lot on the party, including they merge the candidate with the party quite a bit, so there's no harm done, so to speak. But there is strategic voting that goes on where people are not voted for as a local candidate because the people only have the one vote and say, I need to affect the national result by voting for this party, even though I want this local candidate. And as a result, you don't have individuals coming into the House of Commons as much as we would like, who have, let's call it, cross-community and cross-party support as nearly as much as the model I'm about to explain. Other countries successfully use this model, and I'll spend 5 minutes now before Murray starts flapping his hands. You're about to, yeah. These countries, I won't go into the history of how Germany came to it, but it's important. So MMP is a system that produces proportional representation through a mechanism that merges two principles. First principle, second. First is that voters in each local constituency or riding should be able to elect a single MP who is directly accountable to them. That's our current system. The second principle, however, is voters in each constituency should also have their party preference directly count so that party representation, that is the seats in the House of Commons, is proportionate to the degree of support that the party actually received in the national vote. And many would think, well, those are two principles you just can't reconcile. Well, can you not? MMP does reconcile them. So let's take the perspective of you, the voter, going in, hopefully in 2019, and marking a ballot that has two choices. These two principles are merged, if you think of it in terms of what you do on the ballot. You cast two votes on that one ballot. I like to call it a one ballot, two vote system, where you elect a single local MP to represent your riding with your first vote, and you vote for the party you prefer with your second vote. And it's this second vote that results in the number of seats each party gets in the House of Commons reflecting as closely as possible the proportion of votes the party received from the voters. Now, the mechanism for how that happens is not something that I'm going to explain at the moment. We can talk about it in the questions, but just say, I've explained what and I'm about to explain what the washing machine does. I'm not explaining how it works. Another way to think about how these two principles are merged is to say that we combine two sets of MPs. The first set of MPs are elected as local MPs to directly represent the constituency, so call that that was the first vote of the constituency vote. And the second set of MPs are elected from party lists, and that's the party vote. A whole list of individuals' names are there, and you say, okay, if I'm voting for the party, those are the people I'm electing, and some of them are going to end up in Parliament in order to create the proportionality of the MPs in the House. And it's with the number being elected depending on how many are needed to balance out distortions in the party representation that were generated by this additive effect of the first vote. And I'm going to end with a video it comes from New Zealand, where Elections New Zealand, I guess that's called, what's called, explaining to New Zealanders after they'd already spent 2 to 3 elections using their new system, reminding them of what their system was, because they were being asked in a referendum whether to ratify what they had the system that they've been experimenting with.
In the mixed-member proportional system, you have 2 votes. The first vote is for the party you prefer. It largely decides the total number of seats each party will have in this House.
If 40% of us vote for the Heritage Party, it will get about 40% of all the seats in Parliament.
If 10% of us vote for the Freedom Party, it will get about 10% of the seats.
So who sits in these seats? Your second vote is to choose a person to represent your local electorate in Parliament. Under MMP, New Zealand is divided into 70 electorates. Whoever gets the most votes will become your local electorate MP. They don't have to get more than half to win.
The Heritage Party has won many electorate seats. The rest of its share is filled by MPs from its party list. The Freedom Party hasn't won any electorate MPs, but because it won 10% of the party vote, it's entitled to 10% of all the seats in Parliament. They've come from its party list.
To get any seats in Parliament, a party must reach at least 5% of the party vote or win an electorate seat.
The Aroha Party won 3% of the party vote, below the 5% threshold, but it won 1 electorate seat and is therefore entitled to its full share of the 120 seats in Parliament, bringing its total to 4 MPs.
As its name says, MMP is a proportional system. This means there is likely to be a range of big and small parties in this chamber.
And because small parties are present in Parliament, some could be sitting round this table too. Under the mixed-member proportional voting system, governments are usually made up of more than one party, in coalition or with support agreements.
And so my final word, as Murray comes up to kick me in the, the posterior, is just to remind you that the key message is that an NDP government will strike an all-party task force with a mandate to consult experts and ordinary Canadians in order to produce a set of recommendations with the design features of our version of MMP for Canada. We will then introduce legislation, work to legislative deadlines that allow, in hopefully favorable circumstances, the system to be in place by the next federal election, 2019. And when I said hopefully favorable circumstances, I'm sure some of you were thinking, what could he mean by that? part of what I mean by that is there's another institution other than the House of Commons in the Parliament that my colleague Randall Garrison knows so intimately well compared to me because of the tussles he's been having trying to get his gender identity and gender expression bill protecting the rights of transgendered Canadians through the Senate after being passed by the House of Commons. They continue to block it in a big way. And this is not impossible in terms of what the Senate might try to do to this kind of legislation. So when I say as much as possible, it means we are confident we can do it in a House of Commons agenda with a reasonable period of Senate scrutiny. But if the Senate begins to do what it has done periodically, or the history of the Senate, we will be in for a major political fight in order to make sure that this is ready for 2019. And with that, I would simply say that I hope everybody recognizes that in 2015, if you really want to change the electoral system, if you're looking ahead, not just to 2015, but to 2019, that the NDP is there to work with anybody wanting proportional representation so that almost against interest, because we have no idea whether and how much we may benefit or not benefit from this system. We certainly in 2011, we wouldn't have had the same number of seats. That against interest, but for reasons of principle, we will fight to have the system and then make future elections fair elections. So, for example, the Green Party can finally be part of our political system on fair and equal terms. So thank you so much.
Craig, that was a really lucid and thoughtful presentation, and you covered an awful lot of ground. I even understood the New Zealand accent, so that worked out really well. I want to just ask Gary Holman if he could come up and give us just 2 or 3 minutes of what BC NDP is thinking about in this context before I open it up to questions. Gary, are you here? Here he is. I found you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Marie and Craig, and for all the work you do. We're so lucky to have you as our MP here, and just thanks so much for putting this forward this evening. So I hope this isn't too anticlimactic. I can't really see you because the lights are so bright, but I know you're out there. That John Horgan, our leader, has also committed to putting proportional representation back onto the table in British Columbia, and that he has committed, and caucus is committed, that if we're elected in 2017, the next election will be conducted under a proportional representation system. So we are in some sense we're following. MMP has been historically the system that the provincial NDP has favored as well. We haven't necessarily closed the door on the type of PR system. Certainly that's been party policy for some time. And I've just started out on the job that Craig has been doing for some time. So I get to learn, I get to listen and watch and understand. This is really helpful for me tonight in your questions. And please don't direct questions at me. This is Craig's night. And this is just early days for us. My job over the next year is just to consult with stakeholders like Fair Vote BC. I've already attended one of their events. Consult with the public about the devil in the details. And MMP certainly is a more complicated system, but I think the real announcement tonight is that John Horgan, the NDP caucus, is committed to putting PR back on the table in British Columbia and putting it to voters. And if voters want it, we will have a PR system in the 2021 provincial election. Thanks so much.
That's great. Well, Holly's just going to fix the microphone. You can see it there. I would invite anybody that would like to come up and ask questions. Craig, can you come on up? All the tough ones you get to ask Craig, okay? Hi, go ahead.
So are you suggesting that the 338 MPs would still stay at 330 MPs, or we'd have to have more MPs to accommodate the MMP system? And then secondly, what do we do if I vote for a specific party, Green, NDP, Liberal, but I vote independent in my riding? So then how does that fit into the 338 seats?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just looking for a there it is. Yeah, so there are two ways one can go about, well, there are three in fact, but there's one way of determining the number of MPs. Keep in mind that the MPs coming in on the what they call the electorate vote, which in our approach would be you'd be voting first in the electorate vote, and we'd switch the ballot around so that the part doesn't really matter. But and the MPs being elected from the regional list for the party, they're all MPs. They're all being elected two different methods. We're going to have 338 seats in starting from 2015, and the presumption we're working on, unless the consultations after our election and the task force went out suggested Canadians are open to more MPs, we're assuming Canadians will want to keep only 338 MPs. If that's the assumption, and then you roughly have to have about 2/3 that are constituency MPs and roughly 1/3 that are the list MPs. It would mean that on average, and this is a diagram of Toronto, on average for every 3 ridings, so go up here, these are 3 existing ridings under the current system, you might end up having to basically have 2 ridings there instead of 3, and then the remaining MP would end up coming in through the list mechanism. So you do not have to have more than 338, but if you want to retain the size of the ridings, then the necessary result is you have to add MPs, or abolish the Senate and take the 100 senators from there. And there was a second question. Can you remind me?
No, you got it. You got it.
I got it. Okay, thank you.
That's good. That sounds really good. It's good planning for the future. But given the fact that Harper may be calling possibility an early election, what are your plans that if he does call an early election, or if we have to wait until the 15th, I might be voting from heaven by the time this is implemented, yeah. But I'd like to know what your plans are.
Yes.
In the near future.
Yeah, so very good question. We, as a scene setter on that question, we have a statute now in federal parliament that says you have to have your elections middle of October, the 4 years after the last election. So we're supposed to be going to the polls statutorily on October 19th, 2015, roughly a year from now. That's why we talk about 2015, 4 years later would be October 2019. So 4 years is a very doable, if rigorous, period. Harper may well go early for all kinds of reasons we can speculate on. The fact is, nothing is going to change however long he's in there. So whether he goes in 3 months or goes when he should in a year's time, nothing about this will happen. It's all about us saying this is what we are going to do if you allow us to be government or part of government, and then we have our 4 years. We have to then deal with Mr. Harper as potentially the opposition leader or his successor or the dead hand of Mr. Harper in the Senate, but we won't have to deal with him.
So I think you answered one of my questions. You will have to form government in order for this to be implemented, right?
Unless we can convince other parties.
And the second part of my question is, why can you not work together with the Greens for this next election to get more NDP and more Greens into the House?
Yeah. Why can we not? Why must we? We must. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the focus has to be on the Green voter and the NDP voter, and folks who are in the orbit of both. The fact of the matter is, unless I have to be realistic on this, that as of 2015, only one of the two parties, NDP and Green, only the NDP has the chance to form government. The Green Party does not at the moment have that opportunity. So I very much hope that Green voters, where it matters, will consider voting NDP to make sure the NDP gets in more seats than they might have in order to do this, which is in the medium and almost immediate term interest of the Green Party. That said, the form of cooperation has to be left to Green voters, or people who are already now never voted Green but thinking about it. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's nothing really about the way in which our parties, the Green Party and the NDP Party, is interacting that suggests to me that at the moment there's any willingness on the part of Elizabeth, for example, to say the NDP is the only credible party that really is promising PR. We are promising it's essential for the future of the Green Party. It's essential if we're going to combat climate change, everything else.
He actually has said that.
Okay, I'd love to hear, oh boy, give me the quote. Because if Elizabeth were able to say that where it mattered, collaboration includes voting for the NDP, then the deepening of how we would work that out in 2015 would be like a campaign organizer's dream, because it's part of what needs to happen. But I'm putting my faith at the moment in voters understanding that this makes sense. Yeah, I won't say much more because I know I'm in the heart of Green territory here.
I wonder, on God's green earth, or the Parliament, is there any chance that you could force action in this before the next election? I know Stephen Dion, for example, in the Liberals, is definitely for a fairly similar system that you promoted there. And there's probably a few renegades in the Conservative Party, too, that recognize that Canada needs to get rid of the whip system and to get a proportional rep. So that's very speculative. Secondly, I wonder if you would consider putting some nationally known VI, smart, well-educated people that are not into politics onto that list, or into a list that they would have, because that would get around this business of leaders parachuting, trying to find someplace to parachute a candidate in who's a sterling candidate. Well, why force them into this electoral muck that we've got? Put them on the side and choose it. Third, is there any law against, or could it possibly be that in this scenario where you're hoping for cooperation between the Greens and the NDs, not to split the vote again?
Yes.
Could we have a mini vote to decide in each riding which candidate would actually stand?
Well, if on the latter, if there were if people are thinking about doing that in currently held Conservative ridings, that's something that citizens can be thinking about doing. It would be a mistake to be doing it in currently held Green, 1, 2, I guess, and NDP ridings, because I just don't see the point in trying to unseat the existing party that's the only two parties supporting Pierre.
Well, it depends on the candidate that runs next time. It doesn't have to relate to history.
Yeah, it doesn't if the issue that we're discussing is getting proportional representation on the agenda. So it does not at the moment help to elect a Conservative or a Liberal for that purpose.
No, but just a runoff between the Greens and the ND, so that you don't split the vote and get the Conservative in.
Yeah, well, I think you should, my own view is you should first and foremost consider who the incumbent is, who necessarily has the advantage. I don't think there's any mechanism that would work, that would have any integrity, that would suggest that somebody else should be picked ahead of the incumbent, Green or NDP.
So you would approve it for the system where there is a Conservative incumbent?
No, I don't think you're going to be seeing any of that kind of vote splitting. I think you have to, I don't see what scenario one sees that you would think that that system is going to in any way get rid of the chances a Conservative would come in. All this kind of pre-electoral side organizing is more likely to produce the Conservative coming in than it is to actually cause people to follow the advice of a group of people who have organized something on the side. That's been the fact with strategic voting initiatives from civil society. That's the problem.
It's a problem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
are there any constitutional problems? Will changing the system of voting require amending the British North America Act?
Yeah, very good question. The answer is no, with one caveat. Our Constitution requires that you send a number of MPs from each province that reflects the proportion, the population, and every 10 years we update the population numbers to make sure that each province has enough MPs to reflect that principle. That is in the current version of the Constitution Act. BC just got 6 new seats, from 36 to 42, for that very reason. Otherwise, BC would have been underrepresented. So as long as you're sending, using this system, the same number of MPs to the House of Commons as are required under that principle, no constitutional amendment is required. Just the same as in the past, we've had some provinces, people don't realize that we have had history, a little bit in BC, but mostly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, of legislatures changing the voting system. They often didn't stay with it because they did it for very political reasons, but there was no need for any kind of a they was just treated as purely statutory. The Law Commission of Canada is the leading study, almost like a Royal Commission, frankly. You get the same result. And they looked at this closely and said, no, there is no constitutional issue other than the one I pointed out. What's that?
And the Senate.
Okay, but the Senate does not. The Senate is constitutional in the sense that in our current Parliament, they do have to pass the legislation. And so the mega constitutional issue would be, do we have to abolish the Senate first to get this through? But I have a feeling that they would know, ultimately, the Senate would know what side their bread is buttered on when it comes to something like this, where government has the mandate, it passes the House of Commons, and then they try their shenanigans. Good luck.
I was wondering if we end up with the sort of situation that we've had before, where the Conservatives could possibly have a minority government, and then there's a talk about forming a coalition at that stage.
Yes.
Could we finally dispel a myth that this sort of thing cannot be done in Canada? It was ironic that in England, when there was a hung parliament, the first response was, should we go to the Queen? And everyone laughed. So what did we do here? We went to the Governor General. And anyway, I think we should dispel that myth. In 1997, after the election, if I could just have one more question you can ask.
I was just asking whether Murray wanted to do that, because he's as much of a public lawyer as I am.
In 1997, when Chrétien got majority government with 37 or 38% of the vote, it might have been 39.
Yes, it was 39.
I was contacted by someone you probably know in the University of Toronto Law School, David Beattie.
Yep.
And he asked me, at that time I was the leader of the Green Party of Canada, and he asked if I wanted to file, do a charter challenge and of first past the post system. And so I worked with the University of Toronto Law School in putting together a case, the issue, what we were trying to do is to get the Supreme Court to agree that the first past the post system violated the charter. And then we weren't advocating any particular new system, but then it would go back to Parliament for a new system. I'm just wondering if you feel if there's any role, because I think a lot of people in this room are very impatient. Why can't 2011 be the last one? Yeah. And if we could do something through the Supreme Court before he stacks it too much further.
Okay, I'll start with the last one because it's fresh. The one answer is whatever happened, if you ever suddenly get a new court ruling, it would just not be enough time to put a new system in place. So, but the fact of being able to challenge this, there was an attempt. The courts did not buy the argument. It was a very conservative understanding of the link between the right to vote and equality rights, including equality includes the right not to be discriminated against on the grounds of political opinion as well. Something more creative might well have led to a questioning of the system. However, anybody could also have predicted that the courts would go the way they did. They tend to not want to undermine fundamental tenets of our system, our legal system, and our political system in that way. So I have a feeling, and they would say it's up to Parliament anyway.
They said the issue was to say that it was in violation, only not
Yes, yeah.
the system, but to just say that it was in violation of the charter.
I'm just saying it was a good argument. I know David well. I know the case. And it was a good argument, but it was also predictable it would go the way it did. So I think we now are in the position where so many years later we still have to do this through Parliament anyway by getting rid of a government that would never do it. Okay? The first question was very good. Oh, dispelling the myths. Okay. Look. At the time of the prorogation, one of the prorogation crises, Stephen Harper's minions and he himself literally engaged in falsehoods. They tried to convince Canadians, either directly or by constant misdirection, that we live in a system where you cannot replace the Prime Minister or the party in power without going to the electorate. A bald-faced lie. Right? And the result was it confused so many people about the legalities and the constitutionalities that it got mixed up with people's gut sense and moral sense that they began to leverage it very successfully as a communication strategy, and they pulled themselves out of back from the brink. But constitutionally, if three parties if parties get together and say, we, after a vote of confidence, are ready to form government, and there's a signed agreement with all the MPs ready to form that government that have more MPs, a majority of MPs as compared to the party in power, that is a constitutional Westminster tradition transfer of power. And it can also happen after the next election. Now, there's different philosophies about how long you give a government that comes in as a minority, how long do you give them as a chance to form government by getting clear support for a certain period of time. But if it were clear from the beginning that the Conservatives come in with a minority and they're not going to ever get support because the other parties are ready to get rid of them, that's constitutional. Whether or not the parties would do that is a political decision that I have nothing to say about. I actually do not know what the thinking is, because right now we're thinking about getting rid of them so that they're not a minority and certainly not a majority.
Well, look, I just want to say on your behalf, I hope that you agree this has been just a really stimulating event this evening. I'm just so grateful for Craig coming all the way out from Toronto to do this with us and to have this dialogue. I really appreciate your coming out tonight. This was really, really interesting for me, and I really appreciate the thoughtful questions that you posed. Thanks so much.